Hi, welcome to another lecture on cardiovascular physiology. This lecture is about myocardial perfusion, the myocardium, the muscle wall of the heart, myocardial perfusion, the supply of blood to the myocardium. Okay, quick anatomy review. Now, I'm not an anatomist and you'll get more anatomical details elsewhere, but just as a reminder, the myocardium is perfused with oxygenated blood via the coronary arteries. The epicardial vessels are arranged on the surface of the heart like a corona or crown, and that's where the name coronary comes from. So they branch right off the root of the aorta. This is a view of the anterior wall of the heart, so the left side is right here. Over here is the right side. These two main branches are called, conveniently, the left main and the right coronary arteries. The left branches into these two main vessels, the left anterior descending and the left circumflex. The left anterior descending, like the name says, it runs down the anterior wall. It runs along the groove that separates the left and the right ventricles. So you can see that much of this anterior wall of the heart is supplied by the right coronary. So that part of the myocardium is RV free wall, right ventricular free wall. This is a nice picture here because it shows how the LAD, that is the left anterior descending, comes off of the aorta behind the pulmonary arteries, and so does the right coronary. So the LAD tends to supply most of the septum and a good chunk of the left ventricle free wall. The right wraps around the back, as does the circumflex. Like I said, the right supplies mainly the RV free wall. It also usually supplies the SA node, by the way. So if you were going to occlude the right coronary, for example, what would happen? The right ventricle would be in trouble, and right ventricular pumping would suffer. If you were to occlude the LAD, the insult would be the left ventricle myocardium. So let's not forget about the veins. This is a view of the backside or the posterior side of the heart. So the myocardial circulation drains into this coronary sinus of veins, which runs along here between the atria and ventricles. So it actually does not connect to the vena cava, but the venous circulation actually drains right into the right atrium directly. So why does the myocardium need to be perfused with blood? So just like all of the other tissues of the body, a primary reason is that it needs oxygen for its mitochondria to synthesize ATP. In units that are often used in physiology and medicine, the left ventricle consumes around 75 microliters of oxygen per gram of myocardium per minute under baseline resting conditions. So now you probably don't need to be responsible for knowing this calculation, but it's kind of fun and kind of instructive. So we can calculate how much caloric food energy is consumed with that much oxygen. And just doing some unit conversions, it turns out that the left ventricle is consuming energy largely from carbohydrates and fats at a rate of around 4 watts. So you might remember that the left ventricle does about 1 watt of mechanical work. That means it consumes 4 watts of food energy to do that 1 watt of work. And remember, the human body burns energy at around 100 watts, so the left ventricle is responsible for around 4% of total body caloric food energy expenditure. It's perfused with around 2% of cardiac output. Now I want to illustrate a couple of important concepts about oxygen supply to the myocardium. The first concept is shown by a graph over here of the oxygen saturation in the coronary venous blood. The x-axis is the myocardial consumption rate, which increases as the heart works harder during exercise. So somewhere down here at low myocardial oxygen consumption is the resting state conditions. Okay, then up here for very high values of oxygen consumption, the heart is working very hard. So the y-axis, like I said, is venous oxygen saturation. So the arterial blood perfusing the heart is essentially 100% saturated with oxygen. Okay, so you can see that around 80% of the oxygen is extracted from the blood, perfusing the coronary circulation before it exits into the venous sinus with a saturation of around 20%. So during intense exercise, the venous saturation drops a little bit, but overall this relationship is pretty flat. So remember, this axis is the rate at which oxygen is being taken out of the blood, but the amount of oxygen left in the venous blood is pretty constant. Right? So how's that possible? It's possible because the flow goes up with increasing demand. Right? So on this plot on the right, we have the same x-axis, oxygen consumption rate. On the y, we have flow, plotted as perfusion or flow per unit volume of tissue. So in very intense exercise, if you're super fit, you might be able to elicit a 5-fold increase in myocardial oxygen demand. Commensurate with that, you would have a 5-fold increase in oxygen delivery here. So you need flow to go up in lockstep with demand because there's almost no extra oxygen to extract at any given conditions, right? So if we're extracting 80% of the oxygen from the blood, there's not much more to extract. And so by the way, that's kind of a unique thing about the myocardium. So mixed venous blood coming back to the vena cava from the whole body has an oxygen saturation typically greater than 60%. So there's still plenty of leftover oxygen there, but not in the heart. And why does the heart operate that way? Frankly, I don't know, but it does. Okay, so what about these questions down here? So I think we've answered them. So what fraction of oxygen is extracted from coronary blood by the left ventricular myocardium? About 80%. What is the relationship between myocardial oxygen consumption and flow? That's this linear proportional relationship up here. How does that proportional recruitment of flow happen? In the blood pressure regulation video, we talked about how beta-mediated signaling in coronary arterial smooth muscle causes vasodilation. So that's in contrast to what happens in vessels in most tissues where alpha-mediated vasoconstriction dominates. So during exercise, for example, when increased sympathetic drive is causing the heart to work faster and to use more oxygen, that same signal is telling the coronaries to dilate and to deliver more flow. So there's also a feedback mechanism at play. Increased work rate means increased myocardial oxygen consumption rate, which increases oxygen extraction, and through largely mysterious processes, increased extraction signals to vasodilate and to increase flow to help meet demand. So there are a lot of potential players in that metabolically mediated feedback. Adenosine release, CO2 production, lactate and hydrogen ions are all proposed signals in that mechanism. The truth is we really don't know the details. There's also a shear stress dependent or flow mediated vasodilation mechanism that involves nitric oxide, and we'll touch on that in a moment. So I just told you that the metabolic mechanism is largely mysterious. Actually, if you look in a textbook, like this textbook, you might see a picture like this, which shows, again, that there's some mysterious vasodilating factors that are released proportional to tissue metabolism. And that's really about the best that we can do with sort of general confidence. If we want to dig more specifically into the control of coronary vascular tone, so we find that there are a lot of players in multiple pathways at work. So this very good review is more than 10 years old, but the basic landscape remains the same. So now the purpose here is not to go through all of these details. If you're interested, you can dig out the paper. Purpose is really just to show, is just to impress on you that there are lots of pathways and molecular players. So we can see our beta-mediated vasodilation in this picture over here. So we can also see alpha-mediated vasoconstriction over here. By the way, constricting mechanisms are on the left in this picture, and dilating mechanisms are on the right. Okay, so you can see things like angiotensin II acting on AT1 receptors here on the constricting side. Another important thing, shear stress, so which is proportional to the fluid velocity gradient of the vessel wall, signals the production of nitric oxide in the endothelium. So that nitric oxide signals to smooth muscle to generate cyclic GMP. And there are cyclic GMP dependent protein kinases that act on ion channels to depolarize the cell into lower calcium. So that's a vasodilating mechanism because it relaxes vascular smooth muscle. Another thing to look at here, platelets tend to release a couple of vasoconstrictors, thromboxane and 5-HT, also called serotonin. And you see receptors for those things on the constrict side of the diagram here. They also appear on the dilate side because they act on the endothelium to upregulate NO production. So there tends to be a balanced response to these signals from platelets. But if the endothelium is not doing its job well, this mechanism can lead to pathological vasoconstriction, and you'll learn more about that when you learn about coronary artery disease. But for our major purposes here, this is the take-home message. Heart rate, cardiac output, work, coronary flow, myocardial oxygen consumption rate, they all increase and decrease in proportion by coupling regulation of coronary dilation to metabolic needs. So here we have some actual data from an experiment showing that lockstep increase in flow with myocardial oxygen demand. And this diagram over here, we've already seen it. It shows the big picture with neural mediated dilation, metabolic feedback mediated dilation, and shear nitric oxide mediated vasodilation. So oxygen demand and oxygen delivery are in balance. This figure I made from this original from the Lilly textbook of heart disease. The primary determinant of oxygen demand on this side is how hard the heart is working, which is indicated by heart rate and the active stress developed in the myocardial wall during contraction. So this equation gives you an estimate of stress. And stress as a function of pressure in the ventricle, radius of the ventricle wall, and thickness of the wall. So this will be an important relationship when you think about how changes to the morphometry of the heart. For example, if the wall of the heart were to become thin, then a greater stress would be required to generate a given systolic pressure. Okay, so that's the demand side. On the delivery side, there are two categories. The first is resistance to flow, which is mediated by the vasodilation, vasoconstriction state of the coronary arteries, and through the processes we just talked about, right? And then there's the driving force for flow, which is approximated by the diastolic arterial pressure. So why the diastolic pressure? Well, that's kind of another unique thing about myocardial perfusion, and we're going to get to the mechanics of that in just a moment. This is a plot of the mean pressure in the vasculature of the heart as a function of vessel size. And look just only at the control case, this one. So the pressure drop happens in the small arteries or arterioles. Those are vessels on the order of 200 microns in diameter and smaller. So the large epicardial vessels, so these ones that are on the epicardial surface here, are on the order of millimeters in diameter. The small vessels where the pressure drop happens are the ones that are embedded in the tissue. Those smaller arterioles are called resistance vessels because that's where most of the pressure drop is happening. So understanding that helps us to understand something very important about coronary artery disease. So this is a typical figure and also an important figure that you see in textbooks. It shows what happens when you have a stenosis or a narrowing of an epicardial vessel, which is what I'm trying to show here. So in this pathological situation now, the epicardial vessel actually becomes a resistance vessel, okay? And that's because there's an appreciable pressure drop across the stenosis. Okay, so now what is this plot on the right all about? So we're plotting the lesion diameter, or actually what is meant here is the percent of the normal lumen of the vessel that's occluded or narrowed by the stenosis. And so we have flow on this axis, the y-axis. So if you look right in the middle at a fairly substantial lesion, that 50%, the diagram says it has no effect on normal resting flow. So how come? So it's because even if there's a resistance upstream of the normal resistance vessels, normal resistance vessels, the small vessels they can dilate to compensate. So at 50% stenosis, you might have no effect on resting flow and only a small effect on the maximal flow you can recruit. Now, of course, there's no flow possible when there's a complete occlusion. That's easy. But the other important feature here is that the reserve recruitable flow is affected before the resting flow is. Okay, and that's because in order to maintain resting flow, say at 80% lesion, you're using up a good bit of the capacity for vasodilation distal to the stenosis, right? Right? And so now it's not possible to vasodilate to recruit the normal amount of reserve flow. The next important concept is that the coronary artery inflow is least during systole when aortic pressure is the greatest. So this has to do with the idea that the driving force for coronary blood flow is diastolic pressure. So what's going on? So here are the ventricular and aortic pressures during the normal cardiac cycle. And here's a plot of coronary flow at the same time. So the first thing you notice is that the flow is pulsatile. That is, it goes up and down with the heartbeat. And, in fact, it's highest during diastole. During systole, it's very low. And this is all because when the heart beats, the contraction of the heart wall constricts vessels in the wall. And so the heart, which beats to pump blood to the whole body, actually impedes its own blood supply when it contracts. And that's why we think of the diastolic pressure as the driving force for coronary perfusion. Because in diastole, when the vessels are not being squeezed by the contracting myocardium, that's where the flow is the highest. But it's actually not quite so simple. So I'm plotting down here a simulation of coronary blood flow in the left anterior descending coronary artery. And as expected, it's lowest in systole, But if we look at where that flow goes, we can see a more complicated picture. So on the epicardial side, right, plotted here in blue, you don't see a really drastic pulsatility. And that's because the compression due to contraction of the ventricle is least, it's the lowest out near the epicardium. The compression is greatest near the endocardium on the sub-endocardial surface. And the compression is so great on the sub-endocardium that flow is actually squeezed backwards during systole. So that's this curve here. Okay, and so in that case, flow is really high during diastole in the sub-endocardial layer. So the average over the cardiac cycle of all of these flows is roughly the same, but this compression effect where positive flow only happens in diastole is predominantly a phenomenon of the sub-endocardium in contrast to the sub-epicardium. So that fact is going to be important when we look a little more deeply at the effects of a stenosis. So under normal circumstances here on the left, during systole, you're going to be generating a certain pressure in the lumen of the ventricle. Okay, so that's also the pressure in the perfusion artery, which is supplied by the aorta. So here I'm calling it 100 millimeters of mercury. Okay. On the epicardial side, I'm imagining that there may be some small pressure drop to the vessels that are supplying the sub-epicardium. And we have a nice reasonable driving force, say 90 millimeters of mercury to drive the flow. On the endocardial side, so that the contracting ventricle is putting 100 millimeters of mercury compression force on the vessels down there. So you can see how during systole, the pressure gradient can reverse. It's a small gradient, but it's a reverse pressure gradient, and that's causing a backwards flow. So that backwards flow has to become positive during diastole for the net flow to the sub-endocardium to be positive. Okay, so now what happens if you have a stenosis, which is what we're showing here? So perfusion on the epicardial side is affected by the lower pressure due to the stenosis, right? So let's say we have a 50 millimeter of mercury pressure in a sub-epicardial artery. Okay, but you can vasodilate to compensate for that, and because we still have a positive driving force. Okay, and the epicardium might be just fine, at least under resting conditions, because it vasodilates downstream of the stenosis. Okay, but if the ventricular compression is squeezing vessels with 100 millimeters of mercury of pressure on the sub-endocardial side, then we wind up with a really big driving force for backwards flow in systole. So you can't vasodilate to reverse flow with this big backwards pressure gradient. So you would need a lot more forward flow in diastole to compensate, right? Okay, and that's why the sub-endocardium is much more susceptible to ischemia than the epicardium. Okay, and here is a plot from an experiment of perfusion at different layers in the myocardium. So during resting conditions, the perfusion is pretty uniform from endo to epi side. During exercise, it stays pretty uniform. But when you have a stenosis, that's in these two data sets, the problems emerge in the endocardial layers, right? So if you think about one of these experiments representing a person with a stenosis in an epicardial vessel, they might be fine at rest, but when they try to exercise, they're going to be unable to recruit flow, specifically on the endocardial side of the myocardium. And in fact, if we look back at this kind of plot, we should recognize that this curve represents the overall flow. So, and if we drew a curve specifically for the sub-endocardium, then we would expect that to show a greater impact of a given stenosis. So the sub-endocardial curve might look something like this. The sub-epicardial curve might go like this, because the overall curve has to be some kind of average of the two. Now I want to wrap up by looking at a couple of clinically relevant examples. First, let's review the case of normal physiological left ventricular pressure development, this curve, and normal arterial pressure, this curve. So remember, we think of the diastolic pressure difference as the driving force for coronary perfusion. You know, that's really much less true for the sub-epicardium, but for the most part, it's a good way to think about things. So the driving force is shaded in green here. So let's switch that to look at a specific valve problem where the aortic valve does not close properly and it leaks when it's closed. So that's called aortic insufficiency or aortic valve regurgitation. So two things are happening here. One thing is that diastolic pressure is dropping very rapidly because of the backflow into the relaxing ventricle. Another is that we can see that there's been a big compensation resulting in a major increase in left ventricular volume. Okay, so there's a really big ejection in part because the preload is so high, but a good amount of what's ejected in systole comes back the wrong direction in diastole. The important effect on the heart wall is that the ventricle is dilated. So remember this equation? So the R here is the radius of the chamber. So this big dilated ventricle has a big radius, bigger than normal, meaning that active tension development is increased compared to normal, requiring increased oxygen. So there's a double whammy here for coronary perfusion. So there's a reduced driving force, right, because this diastolic pressure is going down so quickly, and there's also increased demand. So this patient might be fine at rest, but he or she might start to feel the effects of sub-endocardial ischemia when he or she walks up a flight of stairs or tries to do some exercise. So, of course, that depends on the status of a lot of other things, like the possible existence of coronary artery disease or other contributing factors. So one more example is another valve thing, aortic stenosis. So there are a lot of things that can cause aortic stenosis. So that means a narrowing of the aortic exit from the heart. Okay, because of that narrowing, there's a big resistance to flow. The result is a huge pressure gradient across the valve. So it's highlighted here in systole, right? The diastolic pressures might be relatively normal, like they are in this picture. So what's the problem? So the problem is that generating all of this extra pressure costs oxygen. So that increase in oxygen demand means that even at rest, this person is already recruiting some of their reserve recruitable coronary dilation capacity. Even at rest, their heart is basically exercising. So this is abnormally high afterload. It's called a pressure overload situation, and it's going to chronically cause all kinds of problems. But even without thinking about those problems, this patient is not going to be able to exercise normally because they're not going to be able to recruit enough coronary perfusion to meet the demands of exercise on top of the already elevated afterload and the demands associated with that afterload.